And joining me now via Zoom from the United States to discuss this globally disturbing social issue is a professional therapist, Paulishia Augillard. Good to have you join us.
Good morning or good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, according to a report from the World Health Organization, one person in every 40 seconds, one person takes his or her life, which will amount to about 8 million in a year. That's a lot of lives lost to suicide every year. You are a professional therapist. When people speak to you who battle issues around suicide, what do you hear? What is the recurring factor, the recurring trend that you hear from them as to why they have these feelings?
So there's a lot of factors, but one of the main things that I hear from clients that I've worked with is access to being judged about what it is that they're experiencing. So in working with adolescents and even with adults, being able to, speak openly about what it is that they're experiencing, whether that be something within their family or a lot of times with adolescents, if they're dealing with challenges in school, such as bullying is a really big one that I've seen, is something that contributes to them feeling despondent, like there's no hope about the situation. And so, it is upon not just the mental health therapist as myself, but, as society as a whole to demystify this stigma about suicide and having thoughts of wanting to harm yourself. I think one of the biggest key factors is having the open conversation, and we've made great strides in continuing, as you talked about World Prevention Suicide Day, to continue the conversation, but we need to do better. We need to do more so that these numbers can decrease.
And when we mention this, when we reel out these figures, when we say 8 million people, or there are 8 million cases of suicide every year, these are not just numbers, these are people who actually think that all hope is lost. And the question again, because I spoke with a mental health expert earlier, and I asked him the same question, and I want to understand if this is a global thing. The triggers, what are the triggers? Because we know that depression is a precursor to the thought of suicide. What are the triggers for depression that you have noticed with people you speak with?
So there are a lot of triggers, like as I talked about earlier, especially in working with adolescents. Peer pressure is often something that I have come across in those not being understood, trying to maintain friendships, trying to make friends, maybe starting this new school year. And you can agree, even with this pandemic that we've experienced, our whole life as we know it has basically changed in terms of our social connection. So when you talk about that, and that being one of the biggest things that children and adolescents thrive and experience and need that connection, that is a big trigger. And so oftentimes when you talk about depression, it is something that moves to, as we talk about the pandemic, that can be very traumatic. And so people are dealing with a lot of trauma around what's going on, and really just having an outlet to be able to speak to somebody about those feelings. And so again, we need to normalize that it's okay if you're feeling not so good, if you're feeling low on the inside, if you're feeling not connected. Being able to teach those coping skills is key in helping to identify those triggers that you talked about.
And I want to speak, because you raised a very interesting point about, the coping mechanism and the stigma that comes with it, because I'm African, and I'm here in Nigeria where, once you're black, people think that you should have enough coping mechanism. We sort of, we think that depression is only for, once you're black, you cannot suffer depression because you're strong enough to withstand all of these issues. And if you're not, then weak, you have to be weak to think depression or to be depressed. Speak to that issue as to whether depression has to relates with race or color.
So depression, of course, in some of the research shows how women are more prone to be experience depressive episodes. However, when you talk about race, it's not across all boards. So when you say Black people or African American people should be able to deal more with feeling depressed or low than their white counterpart, those are really myths. So when we talk about, again, mental health goes across all cultures, all races. And so it's very important to have the conversation. I'm glad that you brought that up, that there's no shame in what it is that you're experiencing. So just because I'm Black, you might be white, Hispanic, brown, we need to be able to say, I don't feel good, and know that it's okay. Because I'm feeling depressed because of something that I might have experienced traumatically, doesn't mean that it's not going on in the Caucasian culture. It just might mean that they're not actually reporting it. And the reason that that happens is because of conversations like what we're talking about, where things are being reported and they're being reported inappropriately or not reported accurately, I should say, in terms of how we experience our mental health versus someone else.
Absolutely. And that's why I'm going to ask you, what can we do? How do we take deliberate, or what sort of deliberate measures, and key emphasis on deliberate actions can be taken to prevent suicide, especially for those around us?
Sure. So I think one of the main things that we need to continue to do is have open conversations. Start in your home, having conversations about mental health and what that means, because oftentimes when people say mental health, they think negatively, and mental health is your whole being, your mind, your body, and your spirit, and how we operate and how we function and interact with each other is key in terms of having a healthy mental health or overall well-being. And so learning that there will be days, there will be times where you might not be feeling your best. You might experience a friendship breakup, or if you're dating, you might experience something that doesn't feel good. But having those open conversations start in the home. And if they're not in the home, again, in our educational system, we have made great strides in, having different campaigns and rallying around, how we're feeling, having small groups, having talks about mental health. But I also think that the early detection and continuing the campaigns, maybe even, having a specific class on mental health. And I know that some districts are working towards doing that, but having mental health classes to be able to identify what these signs are. When you talk about triggers, knowing what your triggers are, because people don't really go around talking about triggers. So being able to break down the languaging and the barriers so that people can feel all over, whether it's adolescence, whether it's your teenage years, whether it's your adult years, that we can have a conversation about how we are feeling and not be felt to be stigmatized about that, so that it shames us, because there's no shame around our mental health. Everyone at some point in their lives has experienced some type of traumatic experience, and my experience is no less or no different than your experience. So again, I think that having talks like this, and I mentioned earlier about, being appropriating or speaking to in the media, on social media, having conversations as we're doing right now, and also being accurate in the numbers that's being reported. Like you talked about that myth about because I'm Black, then I should be stronger versus, my Caucasian counterpart, or somebody that's in the Asian community, or somebody that's in the Latino community. All those things, we need to have conversations about it, because if we don't, that continues to oppress us. And if we're trying to move forward, if we're trying to break the myth or demystify this stigma about suicide, we have to be knowledgeable and educated. And how are we going to do that if we're not having the conversations, not just in our local community, but all the way to the top when we talk about our policies and governmental policies and campaigns that we can continue to put together and work together.
Absolutely. And I'm taking this away from all that you've said. We have to be open to ourselves or true to ourselves about how we truly feel and how we make others feel. Thank you so much for talking to us, professional therapist Paulishia Augillard.
Thank you.